if we are aware of the difference between now the global north and the global south contribution to climate change, is that Africa as it is produces about 4%, less than 9% of the emissions. As Africa, are we able to really open our vision to see the entirety of the value chain?
Indicate based on research that this is real. And there's 50 plus years of data points that can highlight how real this is.
But our conversation is stopping at production and then export it. So meaning the biggest winners are going to be those who are receiving it, the global north. Well, good day everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Ask series. I have with me my co-host here, Hayelom. Hayelom, if you don't mind doing just another set of introductions, and then we can invite our guests.
Absolutely, Brother Brian. It's so good to be here with you. Really excited to dive into the topic. So a little bit about me, Hayelom Tadesse, born and raised between Ethiopia and Sudan. You choose your country, and then moved to the States in '93, and now I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia. Been very fortunate to have an amazing life and career here. And I'm excited to share, my thoughts, as well as what I've learned over the years and how we can continue to uplift Africa.
All right, name is Brian Orina. Hayelom and I are co-hosts of this episode. Recording out of Njeri, Kenya, small town near Kenya's tallest mountain. Technically, Kenya should have had the two tallest African mountains, Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro, but it's depends on who you ask. But yeah, live very close to Mount Kenya. Been fortunate enough to work here with amazing people like Hayelom as well, and excited for the topics that we're going to be discussing today. We are united by a common vision, which is uplifting Africa and the African people, and showing more than what is the standard stereotype as exists across the world. So that is something that brings us together. And we have an amazing guest today, Lorraine, if you don't mind.
Thank you so much. My name is Lorraine Njeri. It's a pleasure being part of this Ask series. I think my history with Brand, it's a while back when I was still doing my attachment I did biosystems engineering, I touched on biosystems engineering.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been fortunate to just continue the space of biosystems, ecosystems, agriculture, climate change, and energy. And I'm looking forward to this discussion. Since I'm hearing we're describing where we currently are at, I am at Murang'a County. It's a county at the central of Kenya, very predominantly positioned with highlands and a very cold, chilly place. I'm really enjoying the chirping birds in the background, and that's a beautiful sight. Happy to engage and share more of my intel. Maybe a bit of my background. I am a technical advisor on green hydrogen development, especially with a focus on the region of Africa, and then merging the spaces between the global south and the global north. So looking forward to sharing more of that as well. Back to you, Brian.
Maybe that's a good starting point. You're in the climate space, and within the climate conversation, there's a lot of separation of the global north, the global south, the impact, the contribution. Why do you think Africa should care? I mean, open question. Why should Africa care? I'm gonna throw in something that are very controversial. Some people say climate change is a fuss. Some people are like, yeah, that's not a thing. Climate change, what? What do you say as someone in this space, I guess?
Let me start with the first one on why Africa should care. I'm sure if we are aware of the difference between now the global north and the global south contribution to climate change, is that Africa as it is produces about 4%, less than 9% of the emissions. But with the discussion that have been happening at UNFCCC is now the central global convention that really drives the climate action discussions between these different entities of the global north and global south. So from all the monitoring that has been happening in the previous COPs, the impacts of this climate change are most felt in Africa, regardless of the little emission. The level of vulnerability and the limited adaptability to this climate change impacts places us as Africa at a point where we bear the most effect, and that's why we should care. It's a whole discussion, but just in a nutshell, the level of vulnerability and our limited capacity to adapt to the impacts places us at a point where us as Africa needs to care. Again, you have to look at these different things that are moving the vehicle, the economic capacity to position ourselves. It's a very big challenge. We're talking about infrastructural gaps. We're talking about lack of access to the basic amenities. This is things like, water, energy, and how does this then tie to the impacts that you're facing as Africa? So in a nutshell, the level of vulnerability and limited adaptability capacity necessitates Africa to be more concerned with this topic. And when we go to the topic of why, or some people who really deem climate change as a facade or as a farce, I always sigh, but then I give patience and grace, because you first have to profile who this person is, a person who's really not being sold on the concept of climate change. But if I can speak from the technical spaces I've been in, yes, there are a couple of 1, 2, 3 people that believe that there is climate change, but not to the level that's being reported, not to the data that is being communicated. The severity of climate change is not as is, because to them, they believe it's all an economic play. It's a pawn of these countries that have been at the center of this geopolitical power, still wanting to dominate that. And for them, they're at that strategical position where they're looking to diversify their economy, and the best fit place is Africa. But then the best entry point for Africa is climate change. So that becomes a divide. Yeah.
That is very interesting. As we dive into that, and I appreciate the background on, perhaps some individuals may have call it a hoax or may not believe in it for whatever reason. I think that the scientific community has been very clear. What is it, like 95% or higher of the science community or scientists indicate based on research that this is real, and there's 50 plus years of data points that can highlight how real this is. The one thing you mentioned is about the economics. I'm curious, do we need to maybe change our framing on this and what it means to Africa? Because there's this idea of, yes, we should be prepared in the event some kind of catastrophic event happens as a result of climate change. We should be ready and prepared to deal with that. But is there maybe a different angle to this, that as an economic engine, renewable energy as an economic engine and job creation for the continent, that we should start to maybe reframe, instead of saying climate change, maybe it's about what does this mean economically, and what does this mean for closing those resource gaps, leveraging the natural resources and tapping into renewable energy. And any thoughts on that? I'm not sure how that conversation is unfolding, but is there an opportunity maybe to rethink how we address that?
We're at, I'd say we've made some strides in pushing the climate conversation in comparison to economics and the economic potential the different countries can achieve. What I would like to say, especially in respect to Africa, is that the conversation is already there. The aligning climate change and climate financing, we're having reference to things like the Green Climate Fund. So this is one of the largest climate funds directed towards supporting reframing climate change impacts in terms of economy generation. But then when we try to go to the basics, you realize, or you can be able to see the efforts practically in terms of, now there's a lot more conversations on green jobs. There's a lot more conversation on green industrialization. There's a lot more conversation on green entrepreneurship. So there's already effort to correlate the discussion of climate change to economy. But now when it comes to Africa, what I would say from where I stand, how we can be able to position ourselves better is asking ourselves, how then can we benefit more from the green job that they're pushing, or the green industrialization they're pushing? Like, as Africa, are we able to really open our vision to see the entirety of the value chain. Let me speak to what I do. I'm a green hydrogen advisor. So green hydrogen, in summary, is production of energy from splitting water, where now you'll have this resource called hydrogen, green hydrogen. There's a lot of talk on Africa jumping onto this because, again, of the usual conversation on the abundant renewable resources, the abundant land. But now, as Africa, you might find the conversation stops at the value hydrogen production brings. But when you compare to how the global north is looking at this economic opportunity it doesn't stop at the production. The production is literally the byproduct. So then they want to change this into the different derivatives. So hydrogen can be turned into fuel that is not being used in our transportation. It can be turned into fertilizer, something that would support Africa in developing our food security. It can then be turned to explosives that can be used in the mining industry. So as Africa, to benefit more on this, are we able to tie the ongoing conversation on climate change, economic opportunities, but demanding more in terms of the value chain? So are we able to, for example, retain this hydrogen we are to produce to export and use it for ourselves to now sell the final product, the value additive aspect?
I want to jump in on the last statement there. When you say we're getting into this train that has a lot of economic value, pretty much, I find that to be a conversation that applies to almost all our resources. It's in green hydrogen and in anything else. We produce a lot. We're abundant in natural resources, minerals, gas and oil. But then we are seen as the source that people pick from the continent, get the most value out of it, and then resell it for higher value. And I'm thinking, why does this continue? Like, this is a new conversation. Green hydrogen is a new conversation. But why are we going to the age-old narrative of Africa produces, the value chain benefits the global north versus against us? Is it lack of information? Is it we just don't know enough about? Is it an information gap? Do we just not know enough about the value that would come out of this value chain? You know what I mean?
Like, I think in terms of green hydrogen,
Yeah.
I would agree it's the information issue because it's a relatively new technology in respect to Africa. Hydrogen has been in production for the longest time, since the 80s. Hydrogen is literally what has fueled the development of America, fueled the development of Europe, but now from the sources of fossil fuels. But now the conversation of, can we now produce hydrogen not from fossil fuels, but from solar, wind, and hydro? When it comes to the African context, it becomes a little bit challenging to understand the other details. So we're at a point where we understand the production of it, but we don't understand the technicality that goes into converting this hydrogen into these different derivatives. And from the organization that I work at JZ, so it's a German agency corporation supporting now development cooperations between the partner countries. So in respect to Kenya, one of the biggest funded pillar is on awareness creation and capacity building. So with the understanding that the progressiveness of Kenya, the progressiveness of Africa in relation to green hydrogen development is tied to capacity building and information, then there's a lot of workshops and funding being pushed to that. So to Brian, I'd say yes, information really plays a big role. And even outside this technical example of green hydrogen, even generally on climate change, when we start getting into the nitty-gritties of what we mean by climate mitigation vis-a-vis climate adaptation, there's still a lot more information that needs to be driven to the local communities especially. And so the other gap that I have seen from where I stand is, as much as there's a lot of discussion on climate change impacts to Africa, are we really speaking it in a language that the African communities understand?
Yeah.
How
Oh,
much
it's just
further are we willing to go to break this barrier of information? If you're communicating something in a language I'm not very conversant in, regardless of how loud or how much funding goes into it, the output will be very limited. So the other challenge, to build on what Brian was saying, is it a barrier breaking information dissemination process? And is it contextual to the different African countries?
On the education piece, before we even go into that, I'm curious, do we even know what resources are available to us today as a continent, if you will? Is there a clear understanding of what resources exist today and who is tapping into those resources to either enrich or generate renewable energy elsewhere, the North versus the South? I'm curious, is there broader understanding just amongst the climate scientist group, if you will, or just general population of, because I've always been curious, like what resources do we have locally to tap into other than sunlight, right? Because Africa's rich in that. Ethiopia being a good example of 13 months of sunshine, like that's what it's known for. So we already have that access. But I'm curious, what other natural resources do we have today to tap into the renewable energy ecosystem?
I'd like to reference the different levels of government. So we have the national government and then we have the subnational government. So the national government has the mandate to support the stock taking of the natural resources within a specific country. And then each nation or the nations that are member states of the UN Convention under the earlier mentioned UNFCCC, so the largest environmental body, there's a requirement for each country to create its own national determined contribution. So this is a policy document, 5-year term document, that now brings together the monitoring and stock taking of the resources therein. And we're talking about abundant sources to what capacity. So now in respect to Kenya, we are leading in the geothermal energy. So geothermal really offers a big opportunity in terms of renewable capacity. What I'm trying to understand, Hayelom, from your question is, are you asking, do we have a quantifiable understanding of the resources we have?
Yeah, because I think so, as a part of, because I'm trying to tap into the education piece, because if there's a lack of awareness of what exists there, then it's going to be really hard for the general population to know what it means to them and how it impacts them and how others are leveraging it. So I was just curious if there's been any studies that kind of highlights, that shows everything that is needed for renewable energy, because something you mentioned earlier is the supply chain. That's very intriguing to me, because the supply chain can create so many economic opportunities, but it also helps determine where it starts, which is the resources, how it flows through that supply chain, and then where does it go. But if people don't know what is available today, it's going to be hard for them to understand how to tap into it, and then how you can create into the production supply chain, if you will, and then ultimately showcase where it's going. So that, in a very, whether it's graphics or data that they can quickly understand and grasp, they can understand what we have, how it can flow or how it's flowing, and then where does it ultimately land.
That actually feeds into a bigger challenge, even outside climate change. So there's this concept called smart cities. And it's essentially support that's going into this at the sub-national level. So in Kenya, we have counties. Brian, how can we define counties?
Would be the use equivalent of states. So you have the country and then the states. Maybe it's the same in Ethiopia. I don't know. Maybe this is it the same, Halo? I am not too
So it would
sure.
be the state and then the city level. Is that
Yeah,
what you're thinking? So would the county be
yeah.
more of a state level?
Would be more like a state level. So you have the federal, in the federal, national, and then that would go down to the county. But yes,
Yeah, okay. Yep. So in the US, it'd be equivalent to most likely like a state. And then
like a
and then
state.
you'll have the cities and then the counties. Surprisingly, the county is like one of the, it's within the city. So anyways.
Uh,
Ah,
so like the state equivalent. So we've
yep.
already determined that the national government is mandated to take stock of all their natural resources they're in. And obviously the national government has the mandate to communicate this information to the public. But now the biggest challenge comes under this concept called smart cities, the digitalization
Mm,
component of cities, where
Mm,
as Africa, we're known to have the challenge of a lack of a centralized data system. But
mm,
as of the recent years, there has been a lot of support to this subnational government, so the city level, the state level, where they're trying to support these different technical officers under the different ministries to see the data that you have in infrastructure, or the data that you have in water, or the data that you have in solar, or the data that you have in land. Can we build a central system that can be accessible to the public. But now the challenge comes in, as much as is this effort, these respective ministries do not have a proper system of reporting the data they're monitoring. So you're seeing how it's a bigger challenge. So as much as the goal is for us to communicate this to the public and for the public to be aware of the value its country has, the challenge is the data aspect. So then the question we're left with is, how do we resolve this to get ourselves to that point of transparency and communication to the public?
That's a really good point. You're right. Without access to the data that the
The
government
data.
entities are capturing, or without the appropriate tool that they need in order to capture the data, it's going to be harder. Is there maybe a simpler approach? And if somebody's out there that knows this better can help as well. Is there maybe a way to kind of highlight these are the type of renewable energies that exist in different parts of the world, right? And that could be solar, it could be green energy, it could be a bunch of other things, right? Whatever the category of renewable energy is that's available out there. And then maybe showing in a graphic or a simpler way, but without having all the quantifiable data, how much of that exists within that. Maybe is there a simpler way to kind of educate the masses without having access to the raw data and the level of specificity that we need to go through, but just kind of highlighting, hey, here are the different types of renewable energy that exist, and here's where Africa across the board has existing either natural resources or the capacity to be able to tap into that. I'm wondering if there's maybe a different way to kind of educate the masses and just educate ourselves as well.
Yeah. Like a simplified and easily consumable as possible. Just
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here are the 10 category of renewable energy. And then, within the known information, because you're right, getting access to the government data or them being able to kind of capture that data, that's a different project or a different initiative that probably needs to be taken into consideration. But being able to kind of map out and say, here are the 10 types of renewable energy, and this is areas where Africa shines. 9 out of the 10, we have 100% capacity to do. Whether we can do it or not, that's totally different, but we have the capacity to do it. I wonder if that is maybe a different approach, a different lens.
That I think my answer would circle back to the NDCs, the National Determined Contribution document. Because in respect to Kenya, that is what has been able to offer information on the different renewable sources now, the solar, the wind, the hydro, the geothermal, and to what capacities, and to what potential that is yet to be explored. So in the context of Kenya, that would be the NDCs. And then now there's now the effort to simplify this information into infographics that are then highlighted into the different national energy policies, that then becomes the source of information to this public on the quantifiable aspects of renewable energy.
You know what I'm thinking? As you're speaking to the technicality of this, it sounds like at this time now. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of effort that's ongoing, but at this time now, it feels like a lot of this information is held in specialized professional groups. Like you have professionals in this space who know a lot about this that's happening, or government representatives, or people who are in this space. Given the impact that climate change has, and we're talking about renewable energy, it's like a mainstay. You're hearing about it every day. I'm thinking if this is something that should be injected into our education systems from as early as possible. Again, we're trying to train people, the African child, to grow in a mindset of self-sustenance, like a mindset of abundance, and like we don't need to rely on outsiders to provide us with this or to help us with this. I'm thinking how important would it be for kids growing up in school, knowing that we have this renewable energy, this is what the value chain looks like. I'm just thinking it's kind of again switching the topic to a bit on education and the education systems that we have and the content that goes into education. I'm pretty sure we stopped any 17-year-old high school student who's gone through, I don't know, what, 14, 15 years of school. They wouldn't know anything about the NDCs, or they wouldn't know anything about the value that renewable energy would bring to the economy, or green jobs, for example. And that's because, I don't know, we're sticking to how old is our education system? I don't even want to think about it. That would scare me.
The 80s.
Yes, it's from the
It's
80s.
not
And a lot of, It is, and it's in the Kenyan example. It's still very British. It's still very British in structure and format and content. So maybe these are some of the conversations that need to be integrated into our education systems. Like you don't have to get into your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s to understand this. It should be as early as 10 years old or 15 years old. Um, but yeah, again, I kind of just digressed into education and how it's formatted. Yeah.
This is one of those meandering conversation that has different moving parts.
Yeah.
But again, the aspect of education is really fundamental to climate change conversation and climate resilience building.
Hmm.
Something notable, I have a brother, he's 7 years old. So
Hmm.
he's one of the people who benefits from this shift from the 844 system to now the CBC, the competency-based curriculum. Something
Hmm.
interesting, last night when he came home, he was telling me what he had learned in tuition the previous week. So he
Hmm.
mentions environmental studies. So I asked him, do you understand anything? It's like, no, I don't understand, but they just keep on telling us about trees and heat. I don't know what that is. So already as Kenya, we're making a very, very big step. And I think CBC was the competency-based curriculum was introduced 2020 or
Very
20,
recently. Very recently. In the last
less than
4 years.
yeah, less than five years.
Mhm.
So Hilom, just for more context, we had previously the 844 system that was 8 years of primary level, 4 years of secondary, 4 years of university, 844. It had very little practicality to it, so it was very theoretical. So now this new education system called CBC, competency-based curriculum system, tries to speak to those challenges of the lack of practicalism in the previous curriculum. So there's that, and then now they're trying to add in concepts like environmental studies and breaking it down to arts, STEM, and environmental topics. So in terms of the question, Brian, you're asking, would it be important for education to be really brought down to the lowest level? It is critical, and there's a defined mandate under the Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement is this overarching document established in 2015 to really synchronize the efforts of all these different member states of the UN in respect to climate action, where they say there's need for intergenerational dialogue. That's the time they like to use,
Oh, it's a
intergenerational
big
dialogue.
one.
So
Mm.
a version of a dialogue that ensures sustainability, and the only way to acquire that is through the lowest level of education. So with my brother being 7 years, he's in PP2, he's in class 1. I don't know, grade 1. You know, now with the children, we're still trying to adapt, but we're making a lot of headway. We're making a lot
Yeah.
of headway. And something also very, very interesting. Let me take you back to green hydrogen. Green
Hmm.
hydrogen, as new as it is, a conversation that has started as recently as 2020, there is already curriculum development activities, but at the vocational level. So at the higher level, post-secondary school, where
Hmm.
they're targeting the vocational students, the ones who really are hands-on, the diploma students, to understand the different applicability of green hydrogen. So now remember we said green hydrogen can be used for fuel production, green hydrogen can be used for fertilizer, green hydrogen can be used, let me just use those two examples. But we need engineers who are able to understand the conversion of this hydrogen to fuels. We need environmentalists who can be able to assess the impacts of this. So we've gotten to a point where the organization I sit with and the other development corporations have partnered with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Education and the department in charge of curriculum development to integrate all these new technologies within energy transition, climate resilience to be incorporated into the foundational mechanical engineering, masonry, ceramic, to have modules on this topic. So we're making some headway. And with this transition, I'm very hopeful for us as Africa, because this is not just something happening in East of Africa. This is the same conversation in South of Africa, North of Africa. We are all really getting attuned to the importance of this intergenerational dialogue through education.
I mean, a lot of reference you're making is to Kenya because it's very contextual in terms of understanding. Maybe we are building a model that can be or should be replicated across more areas within the continent. I like what you brought about, like intergenerational conversation. These are topics we have, like right now we struggle with issues that affected our parents' generations and our grandparents' generations. So that is probably something that we need to change. I like it, intergenerational conversation. I think that's an important thing that needs to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree because I was trying to just do some research as well. Just what does the opportunity look like? I do love what you mentioned, which is there is the Paris Accord, if you will, the mandate for all UN members. I wonder if there is something there that where information is being shared that individuals can capture and simplify. One of the things I was trying to understand is solar. Solar is huge, right? And it seems like Africa is well positioned to lead, just generally speaking, just lead the entire globe when it comes to leveraging solar. And that technology is rapidly expanding. Given that, you know, generally Africa is probably going to have more than 50%, 60%, if not even higher, of all solar potential. I wonder if that is a simpler way of being able to educate the masses. Simple. The sun is a big component of renewable energy, and the continent has the most rich sunlight that you can find no matter what part of the world you go into. So I wonder if it is simple, to your point earlier, simple language that we can use that helps educate them instead of going into the complexities. Because to be honest, green energy is the hydrogen is a very powerful solution, but that can get really complex really fast. But if we just say, hey, it's just a part of water, we're just separating it, and then now we can use that for energy, well, that's a simpler way to kind of educate the masses and so on. So I'm curious, just from your experience, just going back to solar in general, like, do you feel like Africa is tapping into that? Do you feel like there is a good understanding of what that means? Because the Sahara alone can power the whole world free of charge if we can just obviously tap into the sunlight there. But I'm just curious, is that maybe a starting place, is to start with a simple concept like the sun and how that could easily be converted through solar panels into energy that could be used anywhere remotely. It doesn't even have to be in the big cities. Generally speaking, any part of Africa can use that, small villages and so on. Any thoughts there?
Yes, a lot. I do have a lot of thoughts on that. Have you heard of this renewable energy projects that have been halted because of community complaints in terms of the limited or the in disproportionate benefits they're getting from this renewable energy
Mm,
projects? Have you come across such?
I have. Please explain,
Yeah.
elaborate.
Okay. So for example, I'll use a reference in Kenya. Yeah? In the northern part of Kenya, there was this I think what capacity? Before I get the capacity, so in the northern part of Kenya, it's under the Azole section, which is the arid and semi-arid lands. So there's a lot of communal land because the people there are pastoralists. Then it's heavily endowed with sunlight, so solar potential is quite high. Then at that specific section within the northern region, there is the convergence of the monsoon wind, so there's a lot of wind capacity. So there's a lot of investments towards establishing the largest wind power in Kenya. So it was called Lake Turkana Wind Power. I think 169 megawatts. But it got halted a couple of years later because now there's a lot of issues in terms of the community complaining the land that our ancestral communal land that we would use to freely move around during our pastoralistic seasons is now limited because they've gated most of the land. That's number one. Number two, there was a lot of complaints that the information before the establishment of this plant is not the same to what we're experiencing. So there was no mention that once we lease our communal land, that we will not have access to it. We will not have access to our, for example, traditional areas. We will not have access to where our people have been buried, for example. And this is the case even in the Southern Africa. With South Africa and Namibia in reference, there has been a lot of issues again with communities complaining that there is a big development of an RE, of a solar powered plant, yet us as a community closest to that plant do not have access to energy. We're still facing the same issues of energy poverty. I'll get to your point, Halem. Yeah, stay with me. So now the biggest issue that investors have realized is the investments they put in this renewable energy projects is at stake if there's no community acceptance. So with where we've gotten to, there have been again a lot of conversations driven by these UN organizations and the AU body in itself to try and see how then do we protect our community in this transition to energy. So now there was a development of the term called just transition. So just transition means, in the most simplest terms, is a transition towards adapting to renewable energies, protecting and benefiting the community. And this became a challenge tied to the land issue and community issue. So this now becomes a legal aspect. So then there is a lot of need for just transition to be included in all these developments. Just transition then has another concept called just energy transition that requires, as per the different constitutions, even in our constitution of Kenya, there is the right to information. Yeah. And so with the concept of just transition, it's a requirement that any renewable investment follows something called FPIC. FPIC means free, prior, informed consent. And before I even get to the detail of this FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, I can use a different example. So now we've understood the impact of renewable energy to community, and then the risk of community not accepting the project and the losses to the investor. There was this other rave of carbon credits. Yeah. The
That's a big.
concept of offsetting the emissions from these developing countries by the idea that since Africa has a lot of land, we could use their land and the trees within their land to quantify how much carbon it's cleaning, then we pay them for the emissions they've cleaned for us as the developing countries.
Wow.
But then there was a lot of controversies because now what us as Africans did not understand is that our natural conservancies would then be gated. So no more access, because now this has been gazetted as a carbon offsetting land. And remember, as Africa, we're communal. So again, the challenges within the Pan-African activists in this space of energy transition and climate change realize there is no free information, there is no prior information, and there is no informed means there's no simplified information that the community can understand, and there is no utter consent from the community. It tends to be solicited. So with the understanding of FPIC, there have been a lot of civil society organizations that have been formed in the spirit to force these investors, force these people who are the forefront of solar, who are the forefront of hydro, who are the forefront of these energy alternatives, to break down that information to a manner or to a language that is contextual to that specific community. So as Africa, we've been able in the past few years, unfortunately, from the impacts we've faced with the loss of our lands, with the limited access to our cultural lands, we have understood that we have more to risk. And so we have been informed of this model called free, prior, informed consent that then forces these different entities to break down now what you're saying, Hayelom, solar, to a simplified manner of solar emits rays. This rays is heat. The heat can be transferred to energy. It's now a requirement. And there's actually another thing called Community Benefit Sharing Act. This is something that every investor has to articulate in their agreement. And if not, there can be no realization of that solar project they want to set up in Africa. So we're really making headway in terms of, are we really following the free, informed, prior consent to communities in their language and giving all the information that is required for them to give. But again, that is the ideal. That's the ideal model we've been given. But the question is it being practiced?
That's the
And to
okay.
its capacity.
I think you're spot on there, and I really appreciate you because I didn't have that knowledge. So kind of breaking it down, even for us to be able to understand it. I really like where you're landing with this. By simplifying the concepts and showing how it works, it should create some kind of, hopefully a spark, if you will, a light bulb, where at least those who are able and capable can create those community specific, if you will, renewable energy projects. Because one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, and Brian, we talked about this in a previous conversation, how
Yeah.
Africa, has a clean slate, if you will. We don't have to deal with the baggage of what the Western societies or world does, which is they have this old infrastructure. And to bring this old, complex, baked in infrastructure to the modern world, it is so difficult to do. If you compare, let's say, Hong Kong at the pace that it's been moving and advancing the technology versus New York. New York has been longer, has more resources, it's richer. But Hong Kong somewhat started, at least from my perspective, in a cleaner slate and a newer slate where they can take advantage of the newer modern technology, which is why they're a lot more advanced, right? Also, decisions are easier and centralized there.
It caps the development. It caps the potential of exploring or realizing the full potential.
A lot of African countries have been victims of manipulative lending.
Because the cost of electricity is too high for the common mwananchi. What we mean by common mwananchi is by the
Common man.
common citizen, the common man.
We're still really, really far behind. And there's data that proves that. The fact that I think, what is it, almost 300 or so million African children don't even have access to school or don't even go to school.